let Chairman Lancaster decide if he wants to start his meeting.
Yes, I'm ready to go. Is everybody else ready to go?
We're checking one thing, if that's okay.
Give it a minute, it may take a little bit to. Larry Stucker just come up and can't get in. Do you want, well, Barry could get on his, you have your invite, get on your Gmail, and maybe, does Dan Larson need the link as well?
He was trying to get on with his iPad. It's gotta be a computer, I believe.
Well, Larry said he's not at his computer.
So let's call Larry then. Tell him we'll call him.
Never mind.
Is it the 866 number, Brenda?
660 is mobile probably.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sucre's trying to come in here shortly, so we're waiting for that.
He's pretty important, so we'll wait for him.
Definitely.
Jody, I think you gotta click, don't hit hang up. There you go.
The sooner that you could take us over, great. Because apparently,
It's been a common theme for her today.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's gonna run.
She's heard it several times from several
Seven six six 539 4 is not available. At the tone, please record.
Okay, one moment, please.
Tell Larry to answer the phone.
The problem is the commissioners,
What do you think, we're here in person, right?
yeah, I don't know how to do it. I just show up.
Those are just highlights that I want to talk about.
Tell him we're gonna call you on your phone, because I don't know if he's on his phone or, so we'll hold on here a minute before we dial him again.
We're streaming on YouTube. We're using Google Hangouts for the.
We might be.
So what we're actually speaking to is that little when we're in that meeting in person, we have speakers. But the one that actually going into Google,
I haven't heard nothing back from Broncos. Yeah, some games, probably not gonna make the decision until,
You know, they canceled the Hall
Mid-August.
of Fame game. You saw that, right?
no,
Yeah, canceling the Hall of Fame game is not gonna happen this year.
Yeah.
I assume all the preseasons will get canceled, yeah.
Whatever the chairman's like to do with information.
I'll probably still go down there. We'll mask it and have a gun too, so.
Mr. Chairman, this is Brandon. If it's okay, I would recommend that we go ahead and start, and we'll work in the background to get a hold of Mr. Suker. But I also wanted to mention for the live stream audience that if something happens to the live stream, to please go to the WWDO website, and there is a link for a backup to this. The backup link, so click on that if something falls off on the live stream. Correct, Jody? Okay.
Okay. I'd like to call this meeting to order and welcome everyone here. And everyone is important, not only Larry. Appreciate your taking time out of your day to join in and go forward with these rules. Sure appreciate Brandon and Andrew and others who are diligently trying to make this happen. So Commissioner Kaylee, could you do a roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Chairman Lancaster,
Present?
Commissioner Purcell,
Here.
Commissioner Geis,
Here.
Vice Chairman Glick.
Here.
I'm here, Ron Cayley. Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Little has said that he will not be able to attend, correct?
That is correct.
Commissioner Wagner,
Here.
Commissioner Yankee,
Here.
and I believe Commissioner Sucker's still trying to get in, and we can recognize him when he gets in.
Thank you. So, Commissioner Kaylee, that means that we've got a quorum, right?
We do.
Yep, we do. Thank you. Is there anything, we'd like to go to audience introductions first. Could we start maybe with Brandon?
Absolutely. Brandon Gebhardt, Director of Water Development.
Commissioner Ron Cayley,
Andrew Coleman, the Attorney General's Office.
Jody Pring, Water Development Office.
Riley Taylor, Water Development.
Mike Purcell, Water Development Commission.
Barry Lawrence, Water Development Office.
Jason Mead, Water Development Office.
Greg Lanning, State Engineer.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to reintroduce Riley Taylor. She is new to the organization, and she's going to, among other things, take over the duties that Katie Talbot used to do. So you'll get to interact with Riley quite a bit.
Welcome, Riley. We're a pretty good bunch. We're a little rough around the edges, but we're pretty good.
that's a nice way of saying it.
Okay. Before we get started, we hope that Senator Geis continues to recover. Sorry to hear about your fall.
Well, you've been there before.
You're pretty tough, and you're pretty
Thank
valuable.
you for thinking of me.
Okay, Brandon, I think it's time to turn it to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first item of business, according to the agenda, is the approval of the minutes from the June 11th, 2020 meeting. Did you guys want to approve the minutes real quick?
Would someone please make a motion to approve the minutes for our last meeting?
I would move that we approve the minutes of the last meeting.
I second.
It was moved by Senator Geis and seconded by Commissioner Yankee. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any
Aye.
opposed? A motion carries. Back to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Chairman. We did do an update to the agenda. So the agenda for today really is to adopt the emergency rules for the emergency water projects. And then we added adoption of the final rules for the emergency water projects. And essentially what that means is it would allow us to start the rule promulgation process. And the rules will be identical to what we're discussing today. It's just the process takes a different path. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So those are the two agenda items that we would like to talk about. And start off, Mr. Chairman, it's kind of jumping around, but we do have Beth Calloway from the governor's office And she provided some preliminary comments from their office to Chapter 9 of the rules. And she's got other obligations, so if it's okay, I'd like to address the comments that she's provided to us while she's on the phone or on the video conference in case she wants to jump in and discuss anything. But she provided us some very good comments that that all of them are incorporated into the document that we're discussing today in Chapter 9. She added some language to basically identify that the irrigation infrastructure refers to affected irrigation structure, and that's throughout Chapter 9. And then she also brought up a couple of points that I believe we incorporated into the document as well. One of them, the first item is for discussing reimbursements. And I will scroll down to the, as soon as I can get to it, to the language that we included to address her comment on that. And this was actually the language that she offered. And where is that, Andrew?
Real quick, Mr. Director.
Yeah, go ahead,
We're
Andrew.
gonna try and call
Yes.
Commissioner Sluka.
Oh, okay.
Chairman, if I may interrupt just a moment, I'm gonna try to call, Commissioner Stewart.
And then which line?
I've got it right here. Eligible. Trying to get to it.
Should be, I believe it's on page 6.
Page what?
You guys got me? I can hear you.
We can hear you, Mr. Suker. Welcome.
All right.
Welcome, Larry.
Hey, welcome to yourself. I'm glad to get on, I guess. I wasn't around my computer, so I thought I'd have to do it by telephone this time. So anyway, I'm sorry for the delay. I'll start without me.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, if you're looking at the screen on page 9-6, under section 5, paragraph B, Roman numerat I, since our last meeting, this was one of the items that we discussed at the meeting as what is eligible expenses. So we added this entire paragraph, and I will just read it real quickly. This might be one of the only things I read. But the emergency water project eligible expenses include professional services, materials, and labor necessary during and immediately following a disaster to restore operation, minimize the extent of damage, or to protect remaining facilities. Incidental expenses for the temporary repair of facilities damaged as a direct result of the disaster and to restore temporary functionality, even if reduced, may be eligible. In evaluating the eligibility of expenses, the office shall consider, among other factors, if incurred expenses were undertaken with proper consideration for the appropriate scope and timeline needed to conduct the temporary repairs, and that the intent of the emergency water projects account funds is not to repair damage as a result of pre-existing, non-disaster related, or inherently deficient condition, nor is it the intent of these funds to fully rehabilitate pre-disaster functionality or condition. So what we tried to do with this is to limit any of the expenses, the eligibility portion of those expenses, to just dealing with the disaster and the infrastructure as that was damaged at that. This gives us some latitude to still determine what those expenses are, but helps us to define that it is only for the infrastructure that was affected by whatever caused the failure. Is there any, and this language did include the language that the governor's office offered in their cursory review. Any discussion on that or any thoughts or concerns?
Any of the commissioners want to have any input on that, or are we okay?
It's Clinton, I would like to say something. So if like something happens and then you're fixing the whole structure, but it was kind of in disrepair prior to emergency. So if we go ahead and fix it, then they're gonna have to pick up the rest like a betterment fee or what?
So, Mr. Chairman, if I understood the question correctly, what we're looking at here is trying to focus our expenses on just only the infrastructure that was damaged. One of the thoughts that we had as we were developing this, if you take Goshen into account, the tunnel collapsed, and that was really the emergency, is the collapse of the tunnel. Another thing that was impacted by that was the canal upstream that blew out. Kind of an ancillary effect of the damage. If we were looking at that as an example, my thought would be that the repair, at least the temporary repair of the canal, would also be considered, because it's a direct result of the failure, as well as the temporary repair of the tunnel itself. A converse argument to this, and I believe it was discussed at the last meeting, were what if this were a siphon that collapsed and it was under a roadway and it tore out a mile of roadway? My thought behind this, my recommendation would be that this account would be used to not only repair the siphon, but also to repair the roadway enough that functionality is restored, even if it's reduced. So it could just mean a single lane gravel road, but functionality would be restored at that point. It's not the intent of this program to go repave 3 miles of deteriorated road just because something underneath it collapsed.
I think, Mr. Chair, I might add that the language, I think also envisions that the purpose of the expenses would not necessarily be to restore, say, the tunnel to its to a full construction, but it would really be focused on just getting water flowing again, getting operations, rather than focusing on replacing the structure sort of on a permanent basis.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I think this is probably fine. I guess my concern gets to be, if you're making a repair, there's also going to be, along with that umbrella of solving the emergency, there is going to be ancillary and necessary improvements to pre-existing conditions. And we're not boxing ourselves into we got to finish the project. And if part of it does include some neglected facilities to address the emergency, do you think we're all right here? I just wonder if we boxed ourselves so tight that we can't do a complete job.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, my intent, and I think we have it covered, that you can consider anything needed, any repairs, even ancillary, that are required to make this thing operational, could be part of this. That was the intent of this language, is that we have the latitude to figure out what's necessary and what's not.
Mr. Chairman, and you're comfortable with this language?
Andrew, I'm fairly comfortable with the language. I believe that the way I understood the comment from from the governor's office was, do we need to further refine or define what we can, what the affected infrastructure is? And I hesitate to do that because there are other things that I think we need to be allowed to do and have the latitude to do, and I think that we are covered with this language to be able to make that determination.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with that. I think the language here allows that. And I think also it's, to address Commissioner Purcell's concern, I think the statute is broad enough to allow that because, as you were discussing, those items would be required to address the situation, which is the language in the statute. So there would be a connection to the project that I think would allow those expenses to be eligible.
And that,
Mr. Chairman, also
Okay, so Commissioner, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in regard to Commissioner Glick's comment, I think it provides latitude as well that if you decide that the emergency is due to neglect and they just let things go until it became an emergency, we have the flexibility not to fund it based on the wording, so.
and I believe some of this will become more clear as we talk about some of the other changes that we made, but for the sake of Beth's schedule, I wanted to address this first. And if we have questions after we go through the entire changes, then we can add to that as well. But part of, and this plays into the other comment that the governor's office provided, is the scope of the affected irrigation infrastructure. And under section 4, what can be considered by the commission in making their recommendation, and it is under D2, I believe. Yes. No. We're section 4 CII, and I will get to that. We just simply added one word to that sentence. We added the scope, nature, and condition of the permanently inoperable or likely to be rendered inoperable infrastructure. So we can consider what the scope of the project is that we're recommending to SLIB. And I think that plays into Mr. Purcell's question about what can we consider? And we can help define what the scope, or we can consider what the scope is, and that could include some ancillary components.
And that can also be added into the commission's recommendations and what is presented to SLIB to kind of help define what the scope would be.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I agree. I just didn't want the language to be so tight that when we're making our evaluation and recommendations, that we're hamstrung. And if everybody's comfortable this language does not affect those future deliberations and our recommendations, well then I'm fine.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask if Beth has anything to add if she's on, knowing that she's got to leave shortly?
Yes, let's talk, have her talk if she wants.
Hello, everybody. This is Beth Calloway with Governor Gordon's office. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, it's nice to see you virtually. I will just briefly chime in, but Director Gebhardt has covered the two primary topics that our office weighed in on that I think is appropriately covered in the track changes that he's gone over in this discussion. So the first one being reimbursable expenses and what that might be considered by the commission and what the appropriate parameters are on that. And then also the scope of the infrastructure to be covered or deemed eligible. So I really can't add much more. I think it was well articulated, so I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone on the commission has any for me. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions for Beth regarding this new language? Language. Hearing none, I would turn it back to Brandon or Beth to make some more comments about it.
Beth, if you're okay, I'll take back over.
Thank you, Director. Yes, that's fine, and I'm going to have to go to my other commitment shortly, but I will be sure to check back in with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Beth. Back to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after that, we'll kind of take a step back and go back to some of the changes that were made to the entire Chapter 9. I thank Beth for participating and providing her comments and her participation in all of this. Really appreciate it, Beth. So after the meeting on June 15th or whenever it was, we tried to address, I think, 3 key items that were brought up in that meeting, and those were an abbreviated application process to respond very quickly if needed, and it pertained to what we were requiring in the application. So I'll talk about what we changed and how we addressed that. The other one was the question about eligible expenses. We just discussed that. We can get into further discussion if need be. And then the third one was, and we didn't resolve this at the last meeting, but I think we addressed it in this round of comments, and that is the office's review and approval of construction plans and budgets. So we'll talk about the changes that we made in this version to address that and our concern with that language. So I highlighted under section 3 on the screen the applications, and really what we did is we made this a 2-prong application approach, and it kind of depends on the urgency of each application as it comes in. But under section 3, paragraph A, this is kind of an initial application. And all we're requiring of the applicant at this point is basically 3 things. What is the issue? The questioning the eligibility of the sponsor, and what was the cause of the failure or likely to be rendered failure. And that really satisfies, I think, the intent of the bill, so that we can determine that yes, we're going to participate or not. The second phase that could come in as information is learned or gathered by the applicant really goes back to all of the application items that we had originally, but that is the effects of the failure, what needs to be done, or what investigations are needed to determine what needs to be done, what are the costs going to be, what has been done in the past on this structure, what previous work do they have, or current work do they have with the commission, and then what funding is available and what financial information do we need to set up the agreement for the loan grant portion, and gets into who is doing the work, the consultants involved, the contractors involved. So that's the second phase of the application. And the way I see this working is that initially they come to us, say, hey, we've got an emergency. We determine whether it's eligible or not, and then we can make a recommendation to SLIB. That initial recommendation to SLIB may just be asking for enough appropriation to get boots on the ground and get the project going so that we can start answering some of these other questions. And then that information would feed into the second round application where we can make some more informed decisions. And we may go back to SLIB at that point and say, all right, we know more now. Here's what we're recommending for funding. And it may be one recommendation back to SLIB, it may be multiple depending on the situation. But it does give us the ability to hit the ground running with this first application. So we reshuffled some of the requirements that we had in the original document, and it's what you have in front of us. Without reading it, I will ask, does the commission feel comfortable with that approach? And do you think we addressed that question of the urgency of the application process?
Mr. Chairman?
Commissioner Purcell, go ahead.
Yeah, I like this approach. What it does is it gives us enough information to determine if the project's eligible for the program. And it allows us to come up with at least an interim budget to make sure the emergency doesn't get any worse. And then while that's being addressed, we have the time for the full-blown, more specific second phase of the application, which will be the information we need for the ultimate loan grant mix, contract repayment, final budget. So it will put the meat on the bones of the first application, if you will. And I think that lets us react quicker to help in a true emergency quickly. And then at the same time with the second phase, we can become our own professional selves again and make sure we're got the I's dotted and the T's crossed.
Mr. Chairman, I would just add too that depending on the circumstances, if we do have time and there's not a great amount of urgency, we still have the ability to say, all right, before we go to SLIB, we want all of this stuff. Tell us everything you know. We've got some time to compile it and take a bigger package to SLIB if the situation allows.
Any other comments? I like it. I'm glad that it was brought up last meeting and that we're moving forward on this abbreviated application. Any more thoughts? Back to you, Brandon.
Thank you. So the second question concerned eligible expenses, what are we going to pay? And that was the conversation we had previous to this. I don't know if we need to discuss it any further, but it's under section 5, paragraph B, I added this language in that I read previously. I hope that addresses the question about eligible expenses. I think it gives us latitude to determine still what's eligible and what's not, but it also helps to define that it's only for the emergency repair.
Mr. Chairman?
Any of the commissioners have comments? Was that Commissioner Purcell?
Yes. Could we take a step back, Mr. Director? I think an important aspect of this is under right above section 5. And this is the section that was added to talk about Commission may elect to make an initial funding recommendation to the board based on, and then supplemental information. So this carries on with the phased approach, only this is more related to the actual funding.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. That language was added to allow multiple recommendations to SLIB.
I have one comment. This is Kellen. Do we have any I have to start moving. My grandkids are moving in the room. Do we have any verbiage somewhere that says that we're not responsible to reimburse for lost crops or lost this or that as a result of this emergency?
Mr. Chairman, and I'll defer to Andrew to confirm or protest my answer, but I think that when we talk about the scope of the project, that we could cover it within that we're not paying for lost crops, that it's only for the irrigation infrastructure itself. Andrew, do you want to chime in on that question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's true. I think it's some part of what the commission can describe in the scope. I think it's also covered under the eligible expenses that we talked about, and also under the statute in that, because the project is for the irrigation infrastructure and repairs, replacements, or maintenance required to address the failure of the infrastructure. So I don't think, I think when we get into sort of those ancillary private damages, that gets pretty far away from the infrastructure. Also, the focus that's helpful in the statute is the statute limits it to infrastructure where a public entity has kind of the either ownership or the responsibility for operating. And so certainly, by the time we get to crop losses, that's completely separated.
Thank you. And I do feel sorry for the farmers and others who lose during that time, but hopefully their crop insurance takes over and handles that end of it. Any other comments about this part of the rules? I think it was well explained. Thanks. Back to Brandon.
Okay. And then really the other third topic that I took away from the June meeting was the issue of the office's review and approval of construction plans and budgets. Our concern with that language was that for a true approval of our office, and it kind of gets into engineering ethics a little bit too, but typically those review and approvals take time to do appropriately. So we've modified the language to say, and I'm trying to find it, I apologize, I'm not very well versed on where it is.
9.9-7.
Thank you. Page 9.7, second paragraph from the top. So we changed the wording from has reviewed. So I'll just read it. The EWP sponsor shall not make construction funding commitments until after the office provides written concurrence to construction budgets and construction plans. And we feel that removing has reviewed and approved and changing it to provides written concurrence alleviates our concern that we're not approving construction plans. We're just agreeing to the plan that they provide us, and that we will either give them an email or written concurrence that, yeah, go ahead, without putting a burden of liability on the office. And that was the language that we came up with to alleviate that.
Mr. Chairman, I'll add that, I think Brandon's probably going to go there eventually, but we did make a corresponding change into Chapter 8, where it talks about delegated duties to the commission, and so the language would match in both Chapter 8 and Chapter 9.
Sounds good. Any commissioners have any comments or regarding this? So I know this verbiage is in here, but we have an emergency, we get an emergency application, we go get boots on the ground, we know what's needed, and then this is the part that I'm asking for a little clarification on. We send a letter to that water district saying, go ahead. And this is the parameters in which we'll initially help you with. Is that true that that letter goes out and gives them authorization to go ahead?
Mr. Chairman, not necessarily. The agreement that we would sign with them once we approve the project gives them to go ahead to start the work. This
Okay.
specific sentence that we're talking about deals more with, here's, when they present to us their idea of repair, whether that's a contractor saying this is what needs to be done, or if they truly develop construction plans that they give to the contractor, we're talking about that more specifically in this sentence. And we do not want to slow down the process by doing a detailed review and approval of the plans. But we do want to know what the plan is, and then we can say, yeah, we agree with that. Please proceed with that plan. So it's a little different than getting boots on the ground, where the agreement allows that would be signed very early in the process. This deals more with, here's the repairs, do you agree or not? And we'll say, yes, we agree.
Okay. Thank you for that.
As I see it, the letter, okay, they're gonna say I have an emergency. We will visit it. The fact is gonna be go ahead. It's gonna have that letter's gonna have the conditions under how they can perform during that first phase. Like in the case of Goshen, there had to be an alternative analysis. They didn't know whether to go cut and cover or lining. So during the first phase, we could provide them enough money to formulate the final plan. But it would be, there would be things in that letter that would guide what happens during that first phase. It's not just go ahead. It's gonna be more of a directive of here's what you do after we see. They'll send us that first application. We'll review it. The commission will decide eligibility. If we say it's eligibility, then Brandon's office will prepare a letter, as I see it, that says you can go, you have this amount of funds to do X amount of work. Fairly loose, but it'll have money and a fairly broad scope. But the bottom line in in that first letter will be to define the final repairs and budget. And then after we have that, then we can start working. They'll have to start, we can work with them on their second application, which will be the more specific information we need to complete the project. Is that true, Brandon?
That is true, and that initial, as Mr. Purcell was saying, the way I view this, that initial agreement or letter that says you have this much money, what are you gonna go look at? Are you gonna go evaluate your alternatives? And that's what we would be saying is, go tell us what you're gonna do to fix it. That's the initial step. And then this provides us the ability to stay involved in and say, yeah, we agree with that alternative or this alternative, and we're involved in making some of those decisions as they happen.
I have one more question. Will we have to hold a special commission emergency meeting to give authority for this initial money, or do we give you, Director Brandon, the authority in advance to just say, go do it? How does that part of it work? What statute require us to do on that part?
Mr. Chairman, I think I might be able to help. This is Andrew, with that. So the process is the application comes in, the office and the director will provide some initial recommendations on an application. Then it goes to the commission. The commission is not going to be giving an approval at that point. What the commission will do is recommend to the SLIB board whatever that initial amount of money and what the initial authorization for the project. Once SLIB then will actually have to approve any money going out of the emergency account. Once that comes back to the commission, or sorry, when it comes back to the office, then I think we're off to be able to carry out the project that the SLIB has approved and the commission recommended. At that point, I think our intention is to have an agreement entered into with the sponsor that will define what that initial amount of, initial components of the project would be. And then if, so that would be, the commission would be actually having to approve recommendations to go to SLIB to actually, to have the money and the project approved.
And it sounds like a long process, but in all, we envision that if needed, we can cover that whole process in a day, maybe 2 days, depending on the urgency of it.
And all I'll say, Mr. Chairman, is that we have had discussions with the Office of State Lands and made them aware and talked to them about SLIB also meeting, and so they understand the process that we're envisioning.
So, Mr. Chairman, Brandon, so initially, you're gonna put the recommendation together for the commission that says, A, we feel this is eligible for the program, here's why. B, here's what we think is, after talking to the sponsor, what we're gonna do during the first phase, and here's our recommended budget. Then you have the emergency meeting, we approve that, then that goes in agreement form to SLIB?
Yeah, it would come as a board matter to SLIB, who would then approve it, and then it would come back to the office to help make sure it gets implemented, to get the project running.
Thank you.
Thank you, that helped me as well. Does any other commissioners or participants have any comments about this?
And Mr. Chairman, I see a lot of people on mute, so I'd remind them if they do have a comment to make sure they're taking themselves off mute. And if you're on the phone, you need to hit *6 to take yourself off mute.
Or raise your hand and we'll wait for you to get there, or do sign language. We'll have Mike Purcell interpret that. Sorry, that could get out of hand there. We better move on.
Let's
So,
show some
back to you,
decorum, Mr.
Brandon.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So those were the changes to Chapter 9, and those are the significant changes. Without reading everything, I know you guys have all had copies of it. So that's my presentation on Chapter 9. And I can very quickly go over the changes to other chapters that are required because of this. And we discussed a majority of those last time, but I believe that since the last time we met, we only made changes to Chapter 1 and Chapter 8. And Chapter 1, the only change we made is highlighted on the screen right now, but it's under the definition of the EWP sponsor, and it just added the definition that EWP refers to emergency water projects. So it defines the acronym, is all we did in Chapter 1. Chapter 2, since the last time we met, we made no changes to it. Chapter 3, same. And then Chapter 8, and Andrew mentioned this earlier, the only change we made to Chapter 8 since the last time was down at the very end, changing the approved to review and provide concurrence to construction budgets and construction plans. And that's just to relate back to what we did in Chapter 9. Other than that, we made no other changes to any of those other chapters. So, Mr. Chairman, unless there's any other discussion on the emergency rules, we are asking for the commission's approval to approve the emergency rules as they are. And then with that approval, we would send them to the governor's office, who has 2 weeks to review, 10 days to review, and then essentially sign these rules, and they become effectively upon his signature.
There's two different motions in that. Is that true?
I'll get to the second motion. It takes a little bit of discussion, but the approval we're asking for now is the approval of the emergency rules.
Mr. Chairman, I so move.
Second.
It's been moved by Commissioner Purcell and seconded by Commissioner Cayley. Is that what I heard?
Correct.
All in favor? Say aye.
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 Yeah, opposed, if there is any. Are we all good then? Aye, the motion carries. Back to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the second approval that we're requesting today is to allow us to start the formal rule of the permanent rule promulgation. And what that would be is essentially these exact rules that you see that we've talked about. We would just formalize those as a permanent rule promulgation. And that process, we would have to go to public comment. First of all, it would get reviewed by the governor's office. Then it would go to public comment, 45-day public comment period. And then we would incorporate any comments into a final version. And I believe we would see that, however the timing works out, either the October or November meeting, likely to finalize the permanent rules. So what we're asking for today is your approval to start that rule promulgation with these exact same rules.
So are we ready for a motion on that, or are we still in discussion on that?
Mr. Chairman, I have no discussion, other presentation, so it's up to you.
Okay. Somebody want to make a motion?
Yeah, I would make a motion that we approve the start of the rule promulgation.
We have a motion by Commissioner Yankee. Do we have a second?
Second. Mark.
We have a second by Commissioner Cayley again.
That was Mark, I think.
That was
Commissioner
Mark.
Cott.
Thanks, Mark. Seconded by Commissioner Cott. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, if there's any? Motion carries. Back to you, Brandon.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I have any other discussion. We appreciate the recommendations. The next item on the agenda is just this general discussion. I wanted to keep it short, so any discussion that I have will be at the August meeting. But it's any discussion that anybody else has.
Any members of the commission want to weigh in on anything?
I guess, Mr. Chairman, the only point I would make is I thought we would be, with COVID, I thought we'd be a heck of a lot better than where we are the first week in July with the rebound. So unfortunately, the staff's gonna have to prepare positive approach to the August meeting, as well as perhaps a meeting like this again in August.
Mr. Chairman, that was going to be something that I brought up too. Currently, we're on track to have a face-to-face meeting in August. But as Mr. Purcell indicated, that's subject to change. So if these conditions continue, and I think it's largely going to be dependent on what the governor decides, we're still watching that very closely, and more to come on the format of the August meeting. We'll likely be making decisions in the near future on that. We'll have to fit the timeline, but I don't know. We'll have to look at what the current orders are and what we think for attendees and attendance. And of course, any thoughts that you guys have as to your desires for the August meeting. I'm ready for dinners and beer too.
Yeah.
My desire is to have a face-to-face if we can.
I would like to do that as well.
You can make accommodations for, there might be some that are nervous.
That's exactly right. We could, if we do have a face-to-face, we would definitely have accommodations for virtual participation as well.
I have a question, Chairman.
Go ahead.
This is for Brandon. For the rules that were changed or approved today, can I get a copy that have the portions that were changed in a different color than the natural color of black?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Glick, absolutely, we get you whatever you want. One of the things we will be doing is sending out a clean copy to everybody once we incorporate all the comments as our final version. The LSO and the governor's office requires that we give them both understrike and clean versions, so we will be preparing those and getting you all copies of that as well. Commissioner Glick, if you would call me after this and tell me what you want specifically, I'd be happy to get that to you. Just know that a clean copy will be coming out, and Chapter 9 will only be a clean copy because everything's new on that. So there may just be one version of that, but if you want to see track changes, we certainly accommodate.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Does anybody have any more comments? So, Brandon, we've gone through our agenda, and are we at the end, or we got anything else?
Mr. Chairman, I'm done with you. I'm at the end of the agenda.
You're done with us, huh? You've had it with us. Okay. We sure appreciate you and Andrew and the staff working through this. It feels good. It looks good. It's going to be beneficial. Do I have any other comments?
I'd like to make a motion that we...
Go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
Vice Chair Commissioner Glick has made a motion that we adjourn. Do we have a second?
Yep.
That sounded like Commissioner Yankee. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, if any? Meeting is adjourned. thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your afternoon to have this emergency meeting. Thank you to the staff. And we hope that this wasn't overwhelming to Riley. Hope we can go forward and meet face to face in August, but maybe not.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank everybody as well. These special meetings are, I hope, are not the norm, but the exception, and I really appreciate everybody being cooperative with us to get this done. Thank you.
Okay. We'll call it a day so that Commissioner
See ya.
Purcell can go golfing.
Oh, that's already screwed up.
It's too hot now.
I gotta go cut a tree out of the backyard.